Okay, I think we have everyone in. A few people I'm sure will join in a second. So let me just pass it off to our conference organizer, Dr. Katie Fitzgerald, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Thupten Jimba.
So thank you everyone for joining us again this afternoon. We had a wonderful two panel sessions this morning, and we have another in the afternoon. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our today's keynote speaker, Geshe Laramba, Dr. Thupten Jimba. This is the first time I've ever introduced someone that I've had to debate in my own mind whether to begin with the title Geshe Laramba or Doctor. But he received his Geshe Laramba degree from Gandhin's Charité College. He earned a BA in philosophy and a doctorate in religious studies from Cambridge University. He has acted as the principal translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama since 1985 and has translated and edited many of His Holiness's works. He has been and remains to this day a pivotal advocate, not only for disseminating Tibetan works of philosophy and history in multiple languages, but also in revolutionizing the field of translation studies, challenging the ways that we think about oral and written translation and the teaching of classical Tibetan. He is the founder of the Institute of Tibetan Classics and editor of the Library of Tibetan Classics, and has translated works by the most influential figures of Tibetan Buddhist history, including Nagarjuna, Jetsongkhapa, Padmasambhava, Jamyang Shepa, and others. In fact, in preparation for today's conference, I turned to an introduction by His Holiness in a book about meditation, Meditations on Living and Dying, only to realize that this book was actually also edited by Thupten Jimba. Outside of his important work in translation, Thupten Jimba strives to bridge the gap between the academic study of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism in action. How can the Buddhist principles of compassion, altruism, kindness, and interconnectivity be deployed to solve problems within the world today? He acts as a board member for the Mind and Life Institute and the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at the School of Medicine, Stanford University. He is founder of the Compassion Institute and the principal author of the Compassion Cultivation Training Program. He continues to serve the younger generation of scholars and translators by advising students as adjunct professor at the Faculty of Religious Studies at McGill University. And we are so delighted to welcome Dr. Thupten Jimba as our keynote speaker and look forward to a lively discussion after his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for your introduction. And at the beginning, I would like to express my deep appreciation to you and the organizers of this conference, Yale Institute for Sacred Music and the Yale Buddhist Studies Initiative. And to you, Dr. Katie Fitzgerald, for particularly reaching out to me and asking me to speak at your conference. I'm delighted to have this opportunity, partly because it gave me a chance to collect my thoughts, sort of put them together on the question of what are the key insights and perspectives coming from my own Tibetan tradition vis-a-vis death. Generally, I tend to, as far as my own writing and academic work is concerned, I tend to be more in the domain of philosophy and epistemology and translation. And of course, I do quite a bit of Vajrayana text as well, but death and perspectives around death has not really been in my radar that much, other than having had the privilege to be one of the editors for the Penguin Classics edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which at least we claim it to be the definitive and comprehensive version, because it brings together the entire all the text in that collection of Shidro cycle. Of course, all of us who are familiar with the Tibetan studies know that the awareness that in the Tibetan tradition, there is a rich perspective on death is something that the West has come to know quite early, thanks to the translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in the early part of the 20th century, and one of which even attracted the, quite a lengthy intro essay from the famous psychologist Carl Jung. Since then, there has been a real awareness that there is a rich tradition of perspectives on death in the Tibetan tradition. But beyond that, there hasn't been to date much in-depth scholarly attempt to understand and integrate and process what all of these perspectives mean and how can they interact and influence and shape the modern secular perspectives on death and dying. It has happened to a point, but not much. But if you look at other areas, for example, whether it is in philosophy, and particularly in the meditation domain of mindfulness and compassion training, the interaction and the exchange has been much more extensive. So death, I think this mini conference is very timely because partly because the baby boomers are now approaching a point in their life when death is not that much in the far horizons, and baby boomers tend to dominate whatever cultural discourse that is happening in the West. Secondly, I think there is a beginning of kind of a critical questioning of what are the assumptions underlying many of the systems that are in place in Western society with respect to healthcare, with respect to caring for the elderly, end-of-life care. So there's quite a bit of questioning and reflection going on. So this is, it's a very important time, and to be able to bring this kind of interdisciplinary, conversation, so that articulation of the insights and the perspectives and the cultural practices from the Tibetan tradition can be shared in a language that is more accessible. Because sometimes if they remain embedded in very technical scholarship literature, their ability to shape and impact the wider culture it remains limited. So I think this kind of interdisciplinary, I was very impressed by the lineup of speakers in this conference. The perspectives bringing from so many different disciplines is, very impressive. And this is the kind of work that we need. So what I want to do is to draw from several kind of sources, primarily Tibetan textual resources, which is where my strength really lies. And secondly, having lived in a large part of my life in the Tibetan cultural community, is sharing some of the cultural practices around death and dying. And then thirdly, the importance of death, awareness of death, and death-related practices within the perspective of a monastic or non-monastic advanced practitioners. So those are the main perspectives I would like to try to weave together. Now, the first, regular contemplation of death and impermanence is a very important part of a foundational practice in Tibetan Buddhism. And I would argue it is actually a foundational practice in all forms of Buddhism, not just Tibetan, but in Tibetan, it's much more pronounced. And so if you look at the Tibetan tradition, there are two genres of foundational practices. One is Lamrim, stages of the path, although in the Gelug tradition, Lamrim is more dominant, but some version of stages of the path practice is present in all the traditions. Similarly, Lojong is the other genre of foundational practices. Again, Lojong, although originated with Atisha's legacy in the Kadam tradition, but today Lojong is an integral part of all the Tibetan traditions. So if you look at these two foundational practices, and these are, by the way, the two main genre of teaching that are being shared by Tibetan teachers, regardless of whatever specific lineages they may be coming from when they teach outside their community in different languages. In both of these, we will recognize that awareness of death, contemplation of death, is a very important part of the practice. For example, in Lojong, although Lojong prides itself in being an approach for spiritual practice which is not attached to a particular structure, but even then, Lojong lists contemplation of death as one of the 4 preliminary practices, alongside, appreciating the value of human existence, cultivation of conviction in the law of karma, and then contemplation of the suffering of samsaric existence. So we know that contemplation of death aimed at cultivating a kind of a robust awareness of death on a daily basis is an important part of the spiritual practice. And if you look at the psychology behind this, some of which we can intuit from or discern from the way in which those kind of practices are characterized. For example, in the Lamrim genre, awareness of death and cultivation of death practice is referred to as urging us to make our human existence meaningful. And the technical term we use is to urging us to extract the essence of human existence. So what this suggests is that awareness of death, cultivated through contemplation, deliberate contemplation, will give us a sense of urgency and also allow us to really appreciate the value of human existence, the opportunity that we have. So now, for example, in Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chemo, he talks about 3 roots and 3 decisive conclusions that are part of that death awareness practice. The 3 roots are, the certainty of death or inevitability of death. Second is uncertainty of the time. And third is how it is Dharma practice alone that will be of benefit when you die or after your death. So those are the 3 root contemplations. And then correlating with these 3 root contemplations are the 3 decisive conclusions. The first one is that I must practice Dharma because death is inevitable. Second is because death is uncertain, I must practice Dharma now. So there is a sense of urgency. And the third decisive conclusion is I must practice Dharma with the single-pointed dedication. So in other words, I'm not going to get distracted too much. So what we see in this psychology behind this death meditation is the bringing a sense of urgency and being able to appreciate the value that the human existence accords to us when we have the opportunity to be able to seize it. So in other words, if you look at the literature that is coming from people who have had the experience of near death, one very common theme that comes across is how the experience brought them a sense of clarity, that things begin to, assume a sense of proportion, and how they're able to really be much more equanimous towards things that used to bother them and annoy them so much before. So just being able to cut through the pettiness of all the things that normally make us annoyed and being able to know what the right priorities are. So there's a kind of a clarity that comes in. So what these Lamrim and Lojong type death contemplation meditations are asking us to do is to actually deliberately cultivate a fear of death. And Lamrim, for example, identifies 2 types of fear of death. One is a very natural one that is rooted in our attachment to our loved ones, our possessions, and our continual existence. And that kind of natural fear of death, and we tend to suppress it, but it's very natural. But that's not the kind of fear of death that Tsongkhapa and others are suggesting. They are asking to, cultivate deliberately a fear of death of a different kind, where your fear is about dying before you are able to actually take advantage of the human existence and practice Dharma. So here, I don't want to, cite, there's a beautiful passage in Shantideva's, Guide to the Bodhisattva, where in the 2nd chapter, maybe I'll just give you a flavor, read 1 or 2 verses. There's, in verse 32, it says, how can I escape it? I'm continually in a state of alarm. O leaders, let death not come soon to me before my mass of evil is destroyed. How can I escape it? Rescue me quickly, lest death come swiftly before my evil is destroyed. So you can see it's a sort of a deliberate attempt to bring this sort of almost like a visceral, awareness of the inevitability of death and its uncertainty of the time, so that you really seize the most of the opportunity that is accorded to you. So I think this is an important, and then part of that approach also involves reading scriptures, particularly the Buddha's verses. And they generally practitioners tend to choose the verses because they're more poetic. There's one beautiful one which some of you may be familiar. It's in the Dhammapada as well as in the Tibetan Udana Varga, where it says that no such place is found anywhere where one is spared from death, neither in the sky, nor deep in the ocean, nor by hiding in the crevices of mountains. So you can see that this just, the inevitability of death. And then for serious practitioners, one of the important genre for inspiration is really the experiential songs, guru. And when it comes to guru on impermanence and death, Tibetan tradition is very rich. And many writers, practitioners, particularly three stand out for me: the Seven Dalai Lama, and Kongtang, and Zatatru. That those three are great poets, and their poems on impermanence and death are really powerful. I mean, the visual vividness of the visual imagery they portray is really powerful. So in all of these ways, the death awareness is used as a way to bring a sense of proportion. It's almost like, being able to have that clarity of mind that near-death experience tend to bring to people. But for practitioners, we're doing it deliberately and through cultivation. Now, if you look at how these kind of practices actually work, there seem to be, now this is my interpretation, there seems to be a certain ambiguity at the heart of the conception of what death is, and whether the death represents the end of the personal existence or not. So the forcefulness of these kind of contemplation on death seems to really require the ambiguity with respect to death as saying, yes, it is the end, but also it is not really the end. So, because if it is not an end, not an important end, then you can wait until the next life. So what the rush? But on the other hand, if it is really the end, then what's the point of working so hard? Because if this is the only life. And this ambiguity, I would argue, actually goes all the way back to the Buddha. Those who are familiar with Buddhist studies will know that Buddhist tradition is famous for, having a list called 10 unanswered questions according to the Theravadan list. And according to the non-Theravada tradition, the Indo-Tibetan tradition, we list 14 unanswered questions. And two sets of questions relate to the question of death. One is, is the Buddha alive, present after his death, after his nirvana? So there is the other one is the mind same as the body? And Buddha chose not to respond either way, yes or no. And the reason for that is with respect to the relationship between body and mind. If the Buddha said yes to the question, is the body and mind the same? Then it could lead to nihilism, because when the body ceases, the mind will cease as well. That means this is the real end. So he did not say yes. He did not say no, because if he said no, then it could lead to eternalism, which means there is something called Atman, a soul that is eternal, body is impermanent, and then this soul will carry on going. So Buddha did not respond in either way and left it ambiguous. And also, if you look at the early sutras, even with respect to rebirth, the sutras presentation of what rebirth looks like is actually quite enigmatic. They are presented in the form of analogies or metaphors. For example, when you light a second candle from the first one, the second candle is lit, but nothing from the first candle actually moves on to the second candle. That's one imagery. Secondly, when you look into a mirror, the mirror projects back your face and it's reflected. So the mirror, your face does get projected onto the mirror, but nothing from your face actually goes to the mirror. So the Buddha's explanation of the rebirth concept is actually quite poetic and enigmatic. So this kind of ambiguity seems to be, important. But at the same time, some assumption of some kind of continuity seem to be really important for the Buddhist tradition, like for the pan-Indian tradition, except for the Charvakas. Because, those who are familiar with the history of Indian philosophy will know that Charvakas are the punching bags for all of Indian traditions. Charvakas are accused of being nihilists, they're being accused of hedonists, because they reject any concept of rebirth. So, and in fact, there is surprisingly, one of the few instances where Buddha actually, there's a statement that has quite judgy. Buddha, this is quoted in Bhaviveka's Place of Reasoning, where Buddha is credited as saying, "O monks, do not associate with those who are inflated with the arguments of the Charvaka school. Do not honor them. Do not befriend them." So the idea is that you can get infected by this very pernicious nihilistic view, which believes that nothing continues. So I think since this ambiguity seems to be actually quite important, because if the end that is represented by death is not important, that significant, then many of the awareness and contemplation of death doesn't seem to work. But at the same time, if it is the end, then again, it raises questions. Now, on the actual nature of death itself, and at the same time, in the Tibetan tradition, before I forget, quite often, sort of how you relate to death when it comes for you is sometimes seen as a mark of your spiritual evolution. There is a famous statement attributed to the Kadamba master, not one in particular, where it says, and this is quoted in the 5th Dalai Lama's Lamrim, where it says that the best, most advanced spiritual practitioners, when the death comes, they will approach with joy. The intermediate level practitioners will not shirk it. So they're not afraid of it. And then the least level practitioners should at least aim not to have regret when the death. And that, I think, is an interesting way of looking at how you approach death. And so in the Lamrim teaching and Lojong teaching, by cultivating deliberately a specific type of fear of death, Tsongkhapa even suggests that when you actually confront death, you will have no fear. So it's like deliberately cultivating a fear so that when the time actually comes, there will be your response will not be that of fear. Now, what exactly is death? What is the nature of death? Now here, the earlier sources, which are the Abhidharma, for example, in the Abhidharma Kosha, death is really seen as one of the 4 aspects of existence. So there is the birth, and there is the in-between state when you are alive, then there is death, and then there is intermediate state. So all of these 4 states are seen as aspects of one's existence. So death is not seen as some kind of nullification of life, which is often is how it is understood in a purely secular and materialistic context, And furthermore, there is an understanding in Abhidharma and other Buddhist kind of sources that death does involve ultimate separation of the body and mind. And in the Abhidharma, particularly for example, in Asanka's text, it talks about different points of the body from which the consciousness will exit. So there are specific, quite detailed descriptions. But there is also an understanding that the actual state of mind at the final moment of death is a neutral state. So in some ways, there is an assumption that death process involves gradual, withdrawal of many of the sensory and thought modalities, so that ultimately you get to a very subtle state. Now, beyond that, in the Abhidharma, they don't really go into the detail of what that process involves. And on this, then we have to look for resources in the Vajrayana tradition. And in the Vajrayana tradition, then this whole process of dying is fleshed out in much greater detail. And by beginning with the understanding of the dissolution of the body through the dissolution of the 4 elements, from earth to water, from water to fire, fire to wind, and then wind to consciousness. And then finally, the dissolution of the consciousness itself is split into 4 stages, which has a technical term referred to as appearance, increased appearance, and near attainment, and finally the clear light of death. So there are 8 stages, and the literature around this is fairly detailed. For example, in the first 4 stages that are associated with the dissolution of the material part of the human life, there are signs that are identified, both externally observable behavioral signs, as well as internal signs that is subjective to the person dying. So this is one area where my hope is that, that those who are doing research on Tukdam, because for scientific research, you need some kind of handle, and and something to be measured, something detectable. So behavior markers are very important. So some of these indicators of the signs of dissolution that are listed in the text, for example, like when the earth element dissolves, the body becomes limp, and also there's a feeling of sinking in. And then when the water element dissolves, the thoughts become dry, your tongue sort of almost shrivels, begins to feel like it's shriveling. And when the fire element dissolves, your body you feel really cold. And when the wind element dissolves, then your out breath is longer than in breath, and your in breath becomes very shallow. So there are actually behavioral markers which are really identified. But when it comes to the dissolution process of the mind, then of course it all becomes internal. So what this suggests is that death is, although we may see it as one thing, but it is actually a process. It's a process, and culminating in this, final state, which is referred to as the clear light of death. And that is a pure state of luminosity. And because it is a pure state of luminosity, in the tradition, a suggestion is made that by deliberately cultivating awareness of the death processes in your sadhana practice, in your daily practice, you may be able to recognize when these signs appear and then maintain your awareness. Because for an ordinary, normal person, these naturally arise. And when the final, the death, clear light of death arises, it's just so powerful that we have no ability to retain our awareness. So, and one of the aim for the yogis or the advanced practitioners is to really constantly cultivate familiarity with these dissolution signs, and as part of the daily practice. And I remember once His Holiness was asked by a journalist about his daily meditation practice, and one of the things that he said, which really kind of intrigued the journalist, was that he said, I go through at least 5 times simulation of death. So probably he's talking about 5 different sadhanas that he's practicing. So each of these sadhanas involves these meditation. And in technical language, these meditations are referred to as taking death, intermediate state, and rebirth into the path as the 3 Buddha bodies. So I don't want to go into this, but the point is the practice is deliberately cultivated to be able to recognize these dissolution signs. Now, depending on how advanced you are while you are alive, would determine at what point you might be able to utilize the experience of death, the dissolution process. And the ultimate aim of advanced practitioners is to experience what is called the meeting of mother and child clear light. So that's a beautiful imagery. The mother clear light refers to the natural clear light of death that will occur when we die. The child clear light is the meditatively cultivated state of clear light, which is beyond duality, which is cultivated, where your content of your experience is pure luminosity and emptiness. So the advanced yogis, some of whom, there is the possibility that because of their cultivation of this clear light practice, when the actual Mother Clear Light arises at the point of their death, they may be able to seize that opportunity and utilize it and take it onto the path. So that's one of the reasons why, in that Kadampa saying, that most advanced practitioners will approach death with joy. So of course, if you are an advanced practitioner, then you have been preparing for all of this. It's a bit like athletes who've been preparing so hard so that when at the actual competition, they will be able to perform well. So in a sense, something similar is going on here. So now, from a practical point of view, these ideas do have practical implications. For example, like the Abhidharma idea of how the actual moment, the state of mind at the moment of death itself is neutral, has the implication of creating an environment around the dying person which would evoke more virtuous states of mind. So in the Tibetan tradition, when someone is dying, the family members are advised not to show too much strong emotions of grief or wailing and crying around the dying person, because grief and wailing sometimes tend to be focused on yourself because of your own grief, whereas in a traditional Tibetan Buddhist context, when someone is dying, the focus really has to be on the dying person. And what is important is to create that peaceful environment so that the dying person will be able to let through this transition in a peaceful way. And the way that is done for ordinary people is to, show them images of His Holiness or, a Lama that they deeply revere, have some of the family members chant Om Mani Padme Hum next to the person, or in other words, create an ambiance where as much as possible the person's state of mind would remain in a virtuous, positive state of mind. And this is important because according to the Buddhist karmic theory, a very important influence that factors what type of rebirth you are going to take next life is partly influenced by the state of mind you will experience just before dying. So this has a very strong implications for devout Buddhists. Now, for advanced practitioners, then actually it's there's a lot more at stake, if one can use the kind of colloquial language. So, for example, like I've had the privilege to know quite a lot of senior monks because of my monastic years, and one of the monks who was my neighbor, he died. He had a very long kind of chronic physical ailment, but when he passed away, he followed exactly what the tradition expects. And here I would like to just read a passage from Tsongkhapa, which will kind of give you a sense of what is expected. So this is from his text called 5 Stages in a Single Sitting. He says, before the process of dying begins, while the state of mind, one's awareness is still clear, one should mentally give up entirely with no residual sense of attachment, all material belongings through dedicating them towards field of merit, and ensure that one does not remain attached to any possession. Restore whatever infraction that may have occurred with respect to the vows and commitments one has taken. And then cultivate the thought, now, if I were to die, this is fine, so that no resistance remains towards death. Those who are familiar with instructions associated with death in intermediate state, refresh these through reviewing them so that one's mind remains in a virtuous state. Then generate a joyful thought about death as if a child is returning home. Next, engage in practices such as generating oneself into meditation deity, visualizing one's guru and assembly of meditation deities in one's front. Pay homage to them, pray repeatedly with ferventness that one is able to fuse death with clear light and intermediate state with illusory body. So you can see, so in the case of this particular monk, and it's not an unusual story, what he did was he had the self-empowerment rites performed, which is really meant for restoration of the infractions of the precepts and vows. And then when he actually passed away, he had his students sit next to him and chant the sadhana that he was his daily practice. He was a Chakrasamvara practitioner. and asked them to specifically slow down on the death meditation so that the process is, the chanting of the death process is very clear and slow. And he left exactly at the point of the Dhammakaya meditation. So you can see it has real implication on the way in which, in the Tibetan tradition, those who take the Dhamma practice seriously, the way in which they approach death. So I think now these, really kind of suggest a few things. One is an appreciation that death is part of our existence, which I think is very important. So that if death is not just a kind of a negation of life or nullification of life. Secondly, since death is a significant point in one's existence, an ending of a particular chapter, and there has to be a seriousness with which we need to take the inevitability of it. So in some ways, what the tradition is suggesting is that awareness of death is a powerful source of kind of, meaning generation, a purpose generation in your life. And then around the time of death, most important factor is to be able to let go, to be able to let go so that you live in a peaceful way. And for ordinary people, there is even a tradition, and I don't know whether this is practiced now, but when I was a kid, it was being practiced, which is a dying person would offer a significant part of the possession, not a significant portion, but like a kind of a prized cloth or a jewelry or something to the monastery or lamas. And it's referred to as pongta, symbol of letting go. And I think that's really beautiful because it's a sort of a gradual way of helping the dying person to sort of slowly move on to the next phase. So there are these very important kind of, cultural practices, not just textual and, kind of meditation-based approaches, but also quite a lot of cultural practices, which I think is a rich resource to look into. Then, of course, from a kind of another perspective, for example, like one very important area of death practice and rituals is the whole issue around detection of early signs of early portents of death, chitte. This is very rich in the Tibetan tradition. And those who are familiar with the Book of the Dead will know there's a whole genre and list there. And in the Tibetan tradition, those are used partly to prepare for another important practice connected with death, which is the transference of consciousness, phowa. Those who are familiar with the 6 yogas of Naropa practice will know it's one of the key practices. And phowa practice is generally used by individuals who are not that advanced yogis, because if you are advanced yogis, you want to go through the death process in a conscious way to be able to. But kind of, another kind of alternative is to, focus on the phowa practice so that you have some ability to transfer your consciousness. So those are, there's quite a lot of resources there, and I'm just listing them so that given the diversity of the presenters in this particular conference, I think, different aspects of these may interest. So before I conclude, I would like to sort of, make some connection to our contemporary culture setting. My hope is that if you look at the history of Buddhism's encounter with modernity, and particularly secular Western contemporary culture, the inter-engagement and the encounter has had powerfully positive impact. If you look at the whole application of mindfulness in the contemporary world, to the point where it has given rise to a kind of a secular spirituality, if you want, a kind of a contemplative practice without, subscribing to any particular religion. And the applications have been amazing in so many domains, especially in the clinical health domain. We see the same thing happening with regard to compassion training, loving kindness. And on a more intellectual, philosophical side, the engagement between Buddhism and contemporary Western philosophical scientific tradition has been a richness that has come out in the understanding of the human mind, through the mind and life dialogues and all of this, and many of which were inspired by His Holiness. So the impact and the Tibetan tradition itself has benefited deeply from, sort of, for example, like in the epistemological and philosophy of mind in the classical tradition, there was no appreciation of the role brain plays in a human cognition. Now these are being incorporated. Similarly, the Buddhist kind of, tradition's understanding of the physical world, the laws of nature, these have been heavily now influenced and informed by contemporary science. And on the cultural side, the emphasis on gender equality and, for example, manifested in the form of the movement for women ordination, full ordination for women, all of these, and then sort of the importance of not being dogmatic about hierarchy and tradition. All of these have had quite a positive impact on the Buddhist traditions themselves. So my hope is that death, perspectives on death, is another important area where there could be a fruitful, effects coming out of this kind of encounter. To begin with, for example, like the current materialistic or secular perspectives on death is very black and white. I mean, there is no appreciation of process. And that manifests in the form of how you treat the dying person. So for example, I mean, one of the worst nightmares for Tibetan practitioners is to die in a Western hospital or a modern hospital, because, once you're declared clinically dead, they want the bed. So you're going to shove it off to the morgue. So I think there could be emergence of a different kind of cultural attitudes and sensitivity to appreciation of death as a process. And even purely from a scientific point of view, even though at some point you have to say someone is dead, but that characterization there's an arbitrary element to this. Because even if there is no signals in the brain and the heart and respiration, there are still processes going on in the body. So that's what makes the Thuktam research very interesting, because there are still some processes going on in the body. So I think that whole perspectives around understanding the death could really open up by engaging with the Tibetan tradition. Secondly, the Thuktam project, I think, could also shed light on what exactly is going on. This is why I'm quite curious about what the Thuktam researchers have found, because they are speakers in this conference. Because for scientists to get involved, they need to measure something. So I don't know what they're going to measure. But there are some indicators in the Tibetan tradition. For example, like how do we know that the monk has come out of the Thuktam? One of the indicators is that fluids come through the nostrils. So there must be a physiological changes taking place, when the monk is in a Thuktam state. In the case of His Holiness's teacher, he was there for 13 days, Ling Rinpoche. There was about a year and a half ago, there was a monk, or 2 years ago, there was a monk in my own monastery who was in South India. He was there for a long time, attracting thousands of Indian, devotees coming to visit the body, So clearly something is happening to the body. I think those research may shed interesting lights and open up interesting questions to research. And finally, I would argue that whatever Thuktam research may open up may have implications on scientific understanding of consciousness. Because ultimately, we are talking about the mind-body relationship here. So those are my hope. And, I would like to conclude by thanking Katie and your colleagues for really conceiving this conference in a very creative and imaginative way, and bringing such diverse perspectives, even though it is from the Tibetan traditions, but the Tibetan tradition is a big world, and you have been able to bring such diverse perspectives to this very important topic. Thank you. So we can have some questions now.
Okay, thank you so much for, I have taken 100 pages of notes here, given us so much to think about and raised some really important questions and suggestions for future research, which is very helpful for all of us. So we have maybe 13 minutes left for questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question in person, you can raise your hand through the Zoom function, or you can also use the chat as well. Just give one moment here. Maybe I can, oh, well, we already have a question, but maybe I will be selfish for a moment and just, as you were speaking in this last, in your conclusion about the confluence and the kind of positive outcomes that you see potential for in this collaboration between scientific research and the Tukdam Project or other forms of meditation, measurements of meditation and consciousness. I wonder if you have any apprehensions also about the combination of scientific discourses and attempts to kind of measure states of mind with engagement with philosophical and yogic traditions.
I do have, and I like any methodology, the methodology always is going to have some aspects of shortcomings and side effects. So I think that's a sort of very natural. I mean, one thing that I do worry a little bit about is kind of, dogmatically correlating a certain specific markers that are found, whether in brain or peripheral biology, and then equating them with specific states that are listed in the texts. And then beginning to do a backward inference. So there's a kind of it almost becomes like a reductionist kind of approach that I worry a little bit because individuals are so different. And even though the texts may describe a certain types of states in a very generic way, and that's the function of language. Language can never be completely specific, because language involves extrapolation. And language involves usage of universal terms, and universal terms by their very nature are extrapolation. So, and Buddhist tradition is very cognizant of that, because that's why in the Mahayana tradition, there's a lot of suspicion on language's ability to capture reality. So I think that's one thing that I worry, because science generally tend to, because it needs to measure something. And once you measure something, you make it real. And when you make it real, then it becomes the kind of the operationalized construct, and then you start judging others from that standpoint. So there's a reductionist element in science that is to some extent unavoidable, but one needs to approach it with a kind of a critical awareness.
Thank you. I see that Tani Tidwell has her hand up, and she is one of the workers on this particular project, and then I'll look to the chat after. Go ahead, Tani.
It's like they had to undo the unmute part, but Gisela, it's so wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for amazing keynote. I always so love all your talks, and I just really am grateful also for the guidance you have provided to the Tukdam Project as well, just in this brief talk. So my question to you is, in a recent audience with His Holiness, he spoke about the Tukdam Zenitan Denpa and the Tukdam Pelwa, the definitive form of Tukdam, and then the more common form that Samdong Rinpoche has also spoken about. And particularly, he was noting also about the meditative posture and the upright posture as an important sign that we need to be attending to when we come to Tukdam case. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe the textual understanding related to these indications or the oral tradition, and also that we have not been able to come earlier than 22 hours of the postmortem state. So part of what we're relying on is also these later signs. So the dang, the radiance, and the heat.
Yes,
primarily.
yes.
So if there are other signs that you could guide us to, would be greatly appreciated. So thank you so much.
Well, that I mean, I haven't seen any textual reference to those distinctions, but there's kind of an assumption made because, for example, like sometimes we have even ordinary people staying in that kind of state for 3 or 4 days, 4 or 5 days. So I haven't seen any textual evidence, but generally, I think in some ways it's a sort of a backward distinction based on what is known about that person's history of practice. If a person is known to be a good practitioner, then so there might be a slight element of kind of backward inference going on here, but it is something that is spoken of because the fact that someone remains in that state without decomposition for a few days, it happens also to a lot of people. Well, not a lot of people, but ordinary people. But in some cases, the person may not be an advanced yogi in the sense of with a lot of knowledge, but is a good practitioner. For example, like there was a lady who I knew passed away in Bangalore, and she was in Tuktam for quite a while, and I knew her as a very serious practitioner. She was very devoted. I knew her, her grandson was in my same monastery. And when I was a monk there, they were running a restaurant in the camp. So that's how I knew her. But she was a very serious practitioner. She was very devoted and she practiced several hours a day, probably her entire life. So even though she was not a monk, she was not a yogi, just because she's not a yogi and she's not a monk, we cannot say her Tuktam is not a legitimate one. I mean, so I think it's not that clear cut. And on the physical sign, but I know there have been a team in India with the mobile apparatus. Have they not been able to catch before 22 hours, really?
So our team at the Gupta case, the 37-day case, we had the iPhone images beautifully done, but unfortunately we didn't get any images before the 3rd day. Most
Okay.
recently, we had one at Japum Losamling, and they had Amji Digni Chokdup was there through the dying process, but again, no pictures. So we're waiting for this little opportunity.
Yes. Yeah. But generally it is assumed that even if the person is been frail and sick, when the person moves into Tuktam state, the appearance of the body changes. Mm-hmm. The body begins to assume a kind of a luster, and the frailness goes away. There's a beautiful description of that in Tsongkhapa's biography, when he passed away. But I have myself, like you, I have, when my teacher passed away, I was in England, and it took a while for me to get my visa and the travel documents and stuff. So by the time I got there, it was already 3 days, and on the 4 days, and then on the 5th morning, he, began to sort of show the signs of getting out of it. So, but it was the night I arrived, it was very impressive. When I walked into the room and prostrated, and I could feel the energy, and it was an interesting experience, actually, quite deeply moving. That was the only personal experience I have of being in the presence of someone who was in a Tuktam. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
He was in a seated position, and he had been ill for a long time, but at that moment, I mean, his appearance was quite different. So clearly, and then the energy is, one could argue that it's because of my devotion and connection and all the rest. One could say that, but it is a profound experience to be in the presence of something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we're also looking at is the length of time, and maybe that it's not ideal to have the long, prolonged Tuktam, the reincarnation.
Sure.
How would you understand that aspect of how it affects the cognition or the cognitive capacity in the rebirth?
That I don't know. I don't think it really, I would argue it shouldn't matter that much, seriously. But I mean, have you not been able to do any kind of physical kind of, data collection because one would expect that something is going on. So the fact that the fluids come out of the nostrils is a physiological effect.
So to date, we haven't been able to collect any of the fluids yet. So we're now
really? Okay.
collaborating with the Russian team, Dr. Medvedev.
Okay.
And so we have all the equipment ready, but right now we're also looking at maybe taking some of the buccal mucosa and a swipe inside the cheek to look at the changes in the microbiome.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gisela.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Miriam Cameron asked, how does the Tibetan tradition interpret the death of someone who dies in a car accident?
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, it is in the Tibetan tradition, we make a distinction between, you know, sort of two aspects of lifespan. One is a karmic lifespan and the other one is a merit lifespan. So the karmic lifespan is something that is projected as a result of your karma. So, you know, if you're going to live 100 years or 80 years, 70 years, there's a kind of there's an idea that there is a certain finite time that is projected by your life. But just because your karma projects a long life doesn't mean you're going to live that long. And this is where the merit lifespan comes in. So that's why doing pujas to overcome illnesses and obstacles is an important part of ensuring the longevity. But whether or not you can actually, you know, extend the karmic lifespan, that is open to question. Most would say no. So in the case of untimely death, generally it's, you know, either karmic. It's difficult, but from a practitioner's point of view, it's a very tragic experience because a practitioner's aspiration or wish is to be able to go through the death process naturally, even if you're sick, so that you can experience the dying process in a conscious way. And when you die in an accident, it's instant. So that, but then I spoke with some lamas, and they think that even though it may be instant, but the instant is also stretchable. So many of the dissolution can actually go through at that moment too. So they don't think it's that bad, even from a practitioner's point of view.
Wonderful, thank you. Alexandra asks, could you please talk a little bit more about POA? Is it right to translate it as yogic suicide?
That's a good question, actually. Not really. I mean, the text, the POA instruction texts are very specific and instructing us not to apply POA in an untimely manner. And the instruction is to train the POA, but then don't do the actual application. And you should do the actual application only when you observe all the signs. That's one of the reasons why the POA text proceeds with quite a long list of what are the portents of death. Some of them are early ones, some of them nearer portents of death, some of them are more definite. So there's a whole bunch of them, including even in dreams. So POA practitioners are supposed to do the training so that you are trained so that you can apply it. But the actual application, you're really supposed to wait at the right time, because otherwise you're committing suicide. Yeah. So to call POA as a yogic suicide is probably the wrong way of characterizing it. Yeah. Because since the texts themselves deliberately said don't do it, you know, in an untimely manner.
Wonderful. Maximilian has asked, the question relates to declared memories of people who recognize themselves as reincarnated. From the doctrinal point of view, taking into account the non-dual state of clear light of death, how to reconcile it with the conceptualization of the memories? So this question relates to the doctrine.
That's a really, really good question, actually. So there is an inherent tension there, because the clear light of state, when it's experienced, is almost like a kind of a clean state, you know, because you know, what has happened is the pure luminosity. But the tradition would not say, because the clear light of state is a pure luminosity with no traces of any kind of duality, that doesn't mean the potential for duality has all gone away, because this clear light state has arisen naturally. So when the death process comes to an end, then naturally it's going to reconnect with another life, first through the intermediate state. Then the whole cycle begins again. So the memory or impressions, memory is probably not the right word, imprints from the previous life is carried and they resurface. So that's how recollections of previous life would be explained. I mean, we do say tempa in recollection, but in some ways it's more like an impression because tempa in the memory in English has a very specific connotation. So it's more like a kind of there are recognition of individuals, but it's more like a kind of a deja vu type. So I don't think to call it memory in a strict sense is probably not that accurate.
Wonderful. Okay, so we've kept you for 2 minutes over time. So maybe we will say thank you so much to you for this invaluable talk that you've given us today. And we have another panel starting at 3:30 in which Tani is going to also present more on this Tupim project. So I hope that you can join us. So we will have a short break now for everyone to have a little stretch. And then we will be joined by my colleague Heba Arafa Abdel Fattah, who's going to chair our final panel. And we will have hopefully around a half an hour at the end of that for some discussion as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.